On a sweltering Saturday evening in July 1991, the neon lights of the traveling carnival painted the humid air above Cedar Falls in electric blues and reds. The small town nestled in the Ohio Valley had waited all summer for this moment when the rickety Ferris wheel would creak to life against the purple sky, when the smell of funnel cake and cotton candy would drift through the streets, and when the distant sound of carnival music would promise magic to anyone willing to believe. 26-year-old Diana Chambers stood at her kitchen window, watching those distant lights flicker through the maple trees that lined Elm Street. Her fingers drummed against the chipped porcelain sink as she calculated the dollars and cents in her worn leather wallet for what felt like the 100th time that day. $37. Enough for admission, a few rides, and maybe some popcorn if she was careful. "Mama, can we go now?" The voice belonged to 6-year-old Joseph Chambers, whose dark eyes held the same restless energy that had been building in him all week since the carnival posters appeared on every telephone pole in Cedar Falls. He bounced on his toes beside the kitchen table, his small hands pressed against the window glass, leaving smudged fingerprints that caught the fading sunlight. Diana turned from the window and studied her son's face, the way his mouth curved upward in perpetual anticipation, the gap between his front teeth that made his smile so distinctively his own, the cowlick that refused to stay flat, no matter how much water she used on it each morning. At 6 years old, Joseph possessed an infectious enthusiasm for life that both delighted and exhausted her. He had been talking about nothing but the carnival for weeks, collecting quarters in a mason jar and marking days off the calendar with red crayon X's. "In a little while, sweetheart," she said, glancing at the clock above the stove. 6:15. The carnival would be in full swing by now, filled with teenagers on dates and families with armloads of prizes. Diana preferred to arrive after the initial rush, when the crowds thinned slightly and the carnies grew tired enough to let rides go a little longer. She had been working double shifts at Brennan's Diner for 3 weeks to afford this night. As a single mother in a town where opportunities came as rarely as total solar eclipses, Diana had learned to stretch every dollar until it screamed. The carnival represented more than just an evening of entertainment. It was her chance to be the mother she wanted to be, the one who could say yes instead of always explaining why the answer had to be no. Joseph pressed his nose against the glass, fogging it with his breath. "Jenny Morrison said they have a haunted house that's actually scary, not like the one at the church fair. And Tommy Walsh said the tilt-a-whirl goes so fast you can't even see your mom when you're spinning." "Well, we'll just have to see about that," Diana said, unable to suppress a smile. She moved to the small mirror beside the refrigerator and checked her reflection. Brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, minimal makeup that she hoped would survive the humid evening air, a yellow sundress that had been her favorite 3 years ago and was still her favorite now, mainly because it was the only dressy thing she owned that Joseph had never spilled anything on. The house around them bore the comfortable shabbiness of people who cared more about living than appearances. Mismatched furniture that Diana had collected from garage sales and classified ads, walls decorated with Joseph's artwork and school photographs, and the persistent scent of the vanilla candles she burned to mask the lingering odor of fried food that clung to her clothes after long shifts at the diner. Through the thin walls, she could hear Mrs. Patterson next door watching her evening programs, the television volume turned up to combat hearing that had been failing for a decade. The sound was oddly comforting, a reminder that life continued its predictable rhythm even on nights when everything felt possible. "Can we get one of those big stuffed animals?" Joseph asked, turning from the window. "The purple elephant at the ring toss game?" Diana knelt down to his eye level, smoothing the cowlick that immediately sprang back into place. "We'll see what games you're good at, okay? No promises, but we'll have fun trying." The truth was that carnival games were designed to separate hopeful parents from their money with ruthless efficiency, but she couldn't bring herself to explain the mathematics of rigged probability to a 6-year-old whose entire world still operated on the belief that wanting something badly enough might be enough to make it happen. A knock at the front door interrupted her thoughts. Through the screen she could see the silhouette of Rita Coleman, her neighbor from 2 houses down. Rita worked the evening shift at the hospital and often stopped by on her way to work, usually with gossip about someone in town or complaints about her ex-husband's latest failure to send child support. "You heading to the carnival tonight?" Rita asked, stepping into the living room without waiting for an invitation. She was a woman who moved through the world with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her right to occupy any space she entered. "Planning on it," Diana replied, glancing toward Joseph, who had pressed himself against the screen door to get a better view of the carnival lights. "Take my advice. Stick to the south side of the Midway. That's where they put the newer rides, the ones that aren't held together with duct tape and prayer." Rita adjusted her purse strap and lowered her voice slightly. "And keep an eye on that boy of yours. Crowded places like that, it's easy for kids to wander off." The comment sent a small chill through Diana's chest, the kind of automatic maternal anxiety that surfaced whenever someone mentioned the dangers that lurked at the edges of childhood innocence. "He's good about staying close." "I'm sure he is, honey. I'm just saying, carnival people, they're not like us. They drift from town to town, and you never really know who you're dealing with." Rita glanced at her watch and headed for the door. "Y'all have fun, though. Lord knows you both deserve a little excitement." After Rita left, Diana found herself studying Joseph more intently, noting the way he moved with the casual fearlessness of childhood, accepting the world as a fundamentally safe place where mothers could be trusted to protect and strangers existed only as potential sources of candy or cool stories. At 6 years old, he had not yet learned to be afraid of the spaces between streetlights or the faces of people he didn't recognize. "Are you ready, buddy?" she asked, reaching for her purse and the light jacket she always carried despite the heat. A lifetime habit inherited from her mother, who had never trusted weather to remain consistent. Joseph practically vibrated with excitement as they walked down Elm Street toward the fairgrounds behind Cedar Falls Elementary School. The evening air was thick with the promise of summer storms, but the sky remained clear, painted in shades of pink and gold that would have looked artificial if captured in a photograph. Other families were making the same pilgrimage, children skipping ahead of parents who walked with the measured pace of adults calculating the cost of admission, game tickets, and the inevitable requests for food that would follow. The carnival announced itself long before they reached the gates, a symphony of mechanical sounds, human voices, and tinny music that seemed to emanate from a dozen different sources. "Look, Mama." Joseph pointed toward a group of teenagers screaming as they whirled through the air on something called the Gravitron. "Can we ride that one?" "We'll start with something smaller," Diana said, paying the admission fee to a sun-weathered man whose arms were covered in tattoos that seemed to tell stories she couldn't quite read. The money left her wallet, feeling dangerously light, but Joseph's joy as they passed through the gates made the sacrifice feel worthwhile. The carnival midway stretched before them like a neon river, lined with game booths where stuffed animals hung like exotic fruit waiting to be harvested by anyone skilled enough or lucky enough to master the laws of physics that governed basketball tosses and ring throws. Carnies called out encouragements and challenges, their voices blending into a chorus designed to separate visitors from their money with maximum efficiency and minimal guilt. Joseph's attention darted from one attraction to another, the funhouse with its distorted mirrors, the bumper cars where couples screamed and laughed as they crashed into each other, the dart game where balloons popped with satisfying explosions that cut through the ambient noise. Diana felt her own excitement building despite her careful financial calculations. There was something infectious about the carnival atmosphere, a temporary suspension of the ordinary rules that governed their daily lives. They started with the carousel, a vintage ride where hand-carved horses rose and fell to the rhythm of calliope music that seemed to come from another century. Joseph chose a white horse with a flowing mane and a saddle painted with roses, his small hands gripping the brass pole as the ride began to turn. Diana stood at the edge of the platform, watching him rise and fall against the backdrop of lights and colors, and for a moment she forgot about the bills waiting at home. the shifts she would need to pick up next week, and the 100 small worries that usually occupied her thoughts. From the carousel, they moved to the fishing game, where Joseph used a magnetic rod to catch plastic fish from a circular pond. The carney, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and hands that spoke of decades spent handling small prizes and disappointed children, let Joseph fish until he caught enough points for a small stuffed bear, which he clutched to his chest as if it were the most valuable thing in the world. "What should we name him?" Diana asked as they walked toward the next attraction. "Carnival Bear," Joseph replied without hesitation, as if the name had been obvious all along. They played 3 more games, Joseph winning a plastic whistle at the bottle throw, and Diana surprising herself by knocking down enough milk cans to earn a small mirror decorated with the Carnival's logo. The evening was unfolding exactly as she had hoped. Joseph radiating happiness, the warm air carrying the scent of popcorn and cotton candy, and the lights creating a magical backdrop that transformed their small town into something that belonged in a movie. It was nearly 8 o'clock when they found themselves standing in front of the funhouse, its entrance designed to look like a giant clown's mouth. The recorded laughter that played on a continuous loop should have been cheerful, but something about it made Diana's skin crawl slightly. "Can we go through it, Mama?" Joseph asked, though his voice held a note of uncertainty that hadn't been present earlier in the evening. Diana studied the entrance, noting the way the lights created shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. "It might be a little scary, sweetheart. Are you sure you want to try it?" Joseph nodded, though he moved slightly closer to her side. "Jenny Morrison said it's not really scary once you get inside. Just mirrors and stuff." They paid for 2 tickets and stepped through the clown's mouth into a corridor, lined with mirrors that distorted their reflections into impossible shapes. Joseph giggled at first, delighted by the way the mirrors made him look tall and thin, then short and wide. But as they moved deeper into the funhouse, the laughter around them began to sound less joyful and more unsettling. The path through the funhouse was designed to confuse, with false exits and dead ends that forced visitors to backtrack and try again. Diana kept one hand on Joseph's shoulder, guiding him through the maze while her other hand trailed along the wall for orientation. The mirrors reflected their images in endless repetition, creating the illusion that dozens of mothers and sons were making the same journey through the same confusing space. Halfway through the funhouse, Joseph stopped walking. "Mama, I don't like this anymore," he said, his voice smaller than it had been all evening. "We're almost through, buddy," Diana assured him, though she wasn't entirely certain of their location within the maze. "Just a few more turns and we'll be back outside." They continued forward, following what appeared to be the main path, but the mirrors seemed to multiply around them, creating a disorienting effect that made it difficult to judge distances or directions. Diana began to feel a creeping anxiety that had nothing to do with the funhouse's intentionally scary atmosphere, and everything to do with the growing certainty that they were lost. "Excuse me," she called out to a teenager who was navigating the maze ahead of them. "Which way to the exit?" The boy pointed toward what looked like a blank wall, but turned out to be another passage when they approached it. Diana thanked him and guided Joseph toward the indicated direction. But when she looked back a moment later, the teenager had disappeared entirely, leaving her to wonder if he had found the exit or simply been absorbed by the maze of mirrors. 10 minutes later, they emerged from the funhouse into the warm night air, both of them blinking as their eyes readjusted to the carnival lights. Joseph immediately seemed to recover his enthusiasm, the brief fear forgotten in the face of new attractions that beckoned from every direction. "Can we get some cotton candy now?" he asked, pointing toward a stand where an elderly man was spinning pink sugar onto paper cones. Diana checked her wallet. $18 remaining. Enough for cotton candy, maybe one more ride, and possibly a soft drink to share. She nodded, and they joined the short line at the cotton candy stand. While they waited, Diana found herself scanning the faces around them, families with children, teenagers in groups, couples holding hands, and the carnies who moved through the crowd with the easy familiarity of people who had performed these same routines in dozens of different towns. A man in his 30s stood near the ring toss game, not playing but simply observing the families who passed by. His clothes were clean but worn, and something about his posture suggested he was not quite part of the carnival atmosphere that surrounded him. When their eyes met briefly, he looked away quickly, focusing his attention on something in the distance. Diana told herself she was being paranoid, influenced by Rita Coleman's warnings about carnival people and crowded places. The man was probably just someone like her, a local resident who had come to the carnival alone and was enjoying the spectacle from the sidelines. Still, she found herself positioning Joseph slightly behind her as they moved away from the cotton candy stand. "Where should we go next?" she asked Joseph, who was struggling to eat the cotton candy without getting pink sugar all over his face and shirt. "The Ferris wheel," he replied immediately, pointing toward the giant structure that dominated the carnival skyline. "I want to see everything from up there." The Ferris wheel represented the most expensive single ride at the carnival, but Diana had been saving it for last, knowing that it would provide the perfect ending to their evening together. They walked toward the ride, passing game booths where carnies called out encouragements and challenges that seemed designed to appeal to parents' desires to win something impressive for their children. The line for the Ferris wheel was longer than Diana had expected, filled with couples and families who had apparently had the same idea about saving the best for last. They took their place behind a young couple who were clearly on one of their first dates, the girl laughing nervously at everything the boy said while he tried to impress her with stories that were probably only partially true. As they waited, Joseph finished his cotton candy and wiped his hands on the napkins Diana had collected from various food stands throughout the evening. The sugar had left him slightly more energetic than usual, and he bounced from foot to foot while describing everything he wanted to look for when they reached the top of the Ferris wheel. "I bet we can see our house from up there," he said, "and the river, and maybe even the highway where the trucks go." Diana nodded, though she was only partially listening. Her attention had been drawn to the same man she had noticed earlier, who now seemed to be standing near the Ferris wheel line, despite not appearing to be waiting for the ride. When she looked directly at him, he once again shifted his attention elsewhere, but something about his presence continued to make her uncomfortable. "Mama, you're not listening," Joseph said, tugging on her hand. "Sorry, sweetheart. What did you say?" "I asked if we can ride the Ferris wheel twice." Diana glanced at her wallet without opening it, calculating the remaining money against the cost of tickets. "We'll see how it goes, okay?" The line moved forward slowly, each revolution of the wheel carrying passengers up into the night sky before returning them to ground level with expressions of delight or mild disappointment, depending on their expectations and tolerance for heights. Diana watched the faces of people as they descended, noting that most children seemed thrilled while some adults appeared slightly green around the edges. When their turn finally arrived, Diana handed over the ticket money to the ride operator, a teenage boy, whose bored expression suggested he had been collecting tickets and loading passengers for far too many hours. He helped them into one of the brightly painted cars, secured the safety bar across their laps, and stepped back as the wheel began its slow rotation upward. Joseph pressed his face against the side of the car as they rose above the carnival, his excited commentary providing a running narration of everything he could see below. "There's the funhouse, and the carousel, and look, Mama, you can see the whole town from up here." Diana followed his gaze across the landscape that spread out below them in all directions. Cedar Falls looked different from this height, smaller and more contained, with streets laid out in neat patterns and houses that seemed like miniature versions of themselves. Beyond the town limits, farmland stretched toward distant hills that were barely visible in the gathering darkness. At the highest point of the Ferris wheel's rotation, they paused for nearly a minute while other passengers were loaded below. In the temporary stillness, Diana could hear sounds that were normally masked by the carnival's mechanical noise: crickets in the fields beyond the fairgrounds, traffic on the distant highway, and the faint sound of a radio playing country music from someone's car in the parking area. "This is the best night ever," Joseph said, leaning against Diana's arm with the satisfied exhaustion of a child who had experienced exactly as much excitement as he could handle. Diana kissed the top of his head, breathing in the scent of cotton candy and summer air that seemed to have become permanently attached to his hair. "I'm glad you had fun, buddy." The wheel completed 2 more full rotations before coming to a stop at ground level. Diana helped Joseph out of the car, noting that he moved with slightly less energy than he had earlier in the evening. The combination of excitement, sugar, and the late hour was beginning to take its toll. "Should we head home?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from the way Joseph rubbed his eyes with the back of his hand. "Can we just look at the games one more time?" he asked. "I want to see if anyone wins the big stuffed elephant." They walked slowly back through the midway, Joseph clutching his carnival bear and plastic whistle while Diana carried the small mirror and kept track of their remaining money. $3.50, enough for bus fare if they needed it, though she had planned to walk home. The carnival seemed different now that their evening was winding down. The crowds had thinned slightly, and many of the families with young children had already departed, leaving behind teenagers and young adults who would stay until the rides shut down. The carnies looked tired but professional, going through the motions of encouraging late-evening customers, while clearly counting the hours until they could begin the process of breaking down the rides and moving on to the next town. At the ring toss game, they stopped to watch a teenage boy attempt to win the purple elephant that Joseph had admired earlier. The boy threw ring after ring with increasing frustration, each toss landing just slightly off target, while his girlfriend offered encouragement and his friends provided unhelpful advice. After spending what appeared to be his entire evening budget, he walked away empty-handed, leaving the elephant hanging exactly where it had been all evening. "Those games are hard," Joseph observed with the matter-of-fact wisdom of childhood. "Very hard," Diana agreed. "That's how they stay in business." They were preparing to leave when Diana realized that Joseph was no longer beside her. She turned in a slow circle, scanning the immediate area, expecting to see him examining some nearby attraction that had caught his attention. The ring toss game, the funhouse entrance, the cotton candy stand, all were visible, but Joseph was not at any of them. "Joseph," she called, her voice carrying the edge of concern that appeared whenever her son moved beyond her immediate sight. No response came from the crowd of people surrounding her. Diana walked quickly toward the funhouse entrance, thinking he might have wandered back to look at the mirrors again. But the teenage operator reported that no small children had entered in the past 10 minutes. A cold knot began to form in Diana's stomach, the kind of parental panic that started as a whisper and threatened to become a scream. She forced herself to remain calm, to think logically about where a 6-year-old boy might go in a carnival full of fascinating distractions. The carousel was still running, its calliope music drifting across the midway, but Joseph was not among the children riding the painted horses. The bumper cars held only teenagers and young adults, who were more interested in flirting than actually bumping into each other. The dart game, the bottle throw, the fishing pond. Diana checked each one, her voice becoming more urgent as she called Joseph's name. "Excuse me," she said to the woman operating the cotton candy machine. "Have you seen a little boy about this tall, dark hair carrying a small brown teddy bear?" The woman paused in her sugar spinning, considering the question with the serious attention it deserved. "Honey, I see dozens of kids every evening. They all start to look alike after a while. When did you last see him?" "Maybe 5 minutes ago. We were at the ring toss game." And then Diana realized she couldn't complete the sentence because she didn't actually remember the precise moment when Joseph had disappeared from her awareness. The cotton candy woman set down her equipment and called over to the man running the adjacent popcorn stand. "Eddie, you seen a little dark-haired boy go by here in the last few minutes? His mama's looking for him." Eddie shook his head. "Kids blend into the crowd, you know. Could be anywhere." Diana thanked them and continued her search, moving systematically from one end of the midway to the other. With each passing minute, her concern deepened into something that felt very much like fear. Joseph was a good child, obedient and careful, not the type to wander off without permission. If he was not responding to her calls, something was preventing him from doing so. The man she had noticed earlier was no longer visible in the crowd, and Diana found herself wondering if his presence had been more significant than she had originally believed. She tried to remember exactly what he had looked like, but realized that she had been so focused on her general unease that she had failed to note specific details that might be useful to anyone trying to locate him. "Joseph," she called again, her voice now loud enough to carry over the carnival music and mechanical sounds. Several people turned to look at her, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to the dawning recognition that they were witnessing a parent's nightmare unfolding in real time. A security guard approached her, a retired police officer whose main responsibilities involved breaking up fights between drunk teenagers and handling minor disputes over game prizes. His badge read Jim Morrison, and despite his casual uniform, he moved with the authority of someone who had dealt with genuine emergencies. "Ma'am, I heard you calling for someone. Can I help?" Diana described Joseph in as much detail as she could manage, including what he was wearing, what he was carrying, and when she had last seen him. Morrison listened carefully, taking notes on a small pad that he produced from his shirt pocket. "How old is he?" Morrison asked. "6. He just turned 6 last month." Morrison's expression grew more serious. "Okay, ma'am, let's not panic yet. Kids this age, they get distracted by something interesting and just forget to check back with Mom. Happens all the time. But we're going to start looking for him systematically, and I'm going to radio the other security staff to keep an eye out." He spoke into a small radio clipped to his shoulder, describing Joseph and requesting that all Carnival personnel be alerted to watch for him. The professional efficiency of his response was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because someone with experience was now involved. Terrifying because it confirmed that Diana's fears were not unreasonable. "Where exactly were you when you last saw him?" Morrison asked. Diana led him to the ring toss game, pointing out their approximate position and describing the sequence of events as clearly as she could remember them. Morrison examined the area carefully, noting the sight lines and possible directions Joseph might have taken. "Lots of places for a curious kid to explore," he said. "The thing is, most of these games and rides, the operators know to watch for unaccompanied children. If he had tried to get on a ride by himself, someone would have stopped him and brought him to security." The implication hung in the air between them. If Joseph had not simply wandered off to explore something interesting, then other possibilities needed to be considered. Possibilities that Diana did not want to think about, but could no longer ignore. "What do we do now?" she asked. Morrison checked his watch. 9:25. The carnival would begin shutting down in about an hour, and the crowd was already starting to thin as families with young children headed home. "We're going to search every inch of this place," he said. "I've got 3 other security guards, plus all the ride operators and game workers. If he's here, we'll find him." The systematic search began immediately. Security guards and carnival employees spread out across the midway, checking every possible hiding place where a 6-year-old boy might be concealed or trapped. Behind game booths, under rides, in the employee areas that were normally off-limits to customers, every space large enough to hold a child was examined thoroughly. Diana followed Morrison as he coordinated the search, her heart pounding with the rhythm of panic that she was fighting to control. Around them, other carnival visitors began to realize that something serious was happening. Some stopped to ask if they could help, while others hurried past with the uncomfortable expressions of people who were witnessing someone else's crisis and wanted to escape before it touched their own lives. By 10 o'clock, they had searched the entire carnival grounds twice. Joseph was nowhere to be found. Morrison gathered his security team near the entrance gate, their faces grave in the harsh light of the overhead bulbs. Diana stood at the edge of their circle, listening to their report with growing desperation. "We've checked everything," one of the guards reported. "If that boy is still on the grounds, he's hidden somewhere we can't reach him. And that doesn't seem likely." Morrison nodded and turned to Diana. "Ma'am, I think it's time to call the police. This has moved beyond what we can handle with Carnival security." The words hit Diana like a physical blow. Calling the police meant acknowledging that Joseph's disappearance was not a simple case of a child wandering off and getting temporarily lost. It meant accepting that something terrible might have happened to her son while she was standing only feet away from him, distracted by the carnival atmosphere and her own enjoyment of the evening. "Yes," she said, her voice barely audible above the sounds of the carnival shutting down around them. "Please call them." As Morrison reached for his radio, Diana found herself staring at the Ferris wheel, which had stopped turning and now stood motionless against the star-filled sky. Less than an hour ago, she and Joseph had been at the top of that wheel, looking out over their small town, while he chatted about everything he could see from that height. It felt like a lifetime ago, as if the woman who had enjoyed that moment with her son was a different person entirely from the one who now stood watching security guards and carnival workers pack up the games where her child had been playing just minutes before disappearing forever. The carnival lights began to dim as Diana waited for the police to arrive, and with them the official beginning of what she somehow knew would become the most important investigation of her life, and quite possibly the end of everything she had understood about the world being a safe place for children to exist. The Cedar Falls Police Department consisted of exactly 7 officers, 2 patrol cars, and a station house that had been built in 1952 and hadn't been updated since the Carter administration. When the call came in about a missing child at the carnival, Sergeant Ray Kowalski was finishing his second cup of coffee and trying to decide whether the disturbance at Murphy's Bar was worth investigating or just another case of farmers arguing about grain prices after too many beers. The missing child call changed everything. Kowalski had been a cop for 18 years, long enough to know that most missing kid cases involved children who had wandered off to explore something interesting and were found within an hour, usually hiding under a ride or fallen asleep behind a game booth. But something about this call felt different. The security guard who reported it sounded genuinely worried, and in Kowalski's experience, carnival security didn't worry about much except keeping drunk teenagers from starting fights. He radioed for backup and drove toward the elementary school, noting that the carnival lights were already beginning to dim as rides shut down for the evening. By the time he arrived at the fairgrounds, the midway had taken on the melancholy atmosphere of a party that was ending too early, with carnies starting to secure equipment while a few stragglers wandered between the remaining open attractions. Morrison met him at the entrance gate, leading him quickly toward the area where Diana Chambers stood, surrounded by a small group of carnival workers who had volunteered to continue searching. Even from a distance, Kowalski could see the particular strain of panic that belonged exclusively to parents whose children had vanished, a combination of desperate hope and growing terror that he had witnessed too many times in his career. "Ma'am, I'm Sergeant Kowalski with the Cedar Falls Police," he said, approaching Diana with the careful tone he reserved for people who were barely holding themselves together. "I need to ask you some questions about your son." Diana looked up at him with eyes that seemed to have aged years in the past hour. Her yellow sundress was wrinkled and damp with perspiration, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the small mirror and plastic whistle that Joseph had won earlier in the evening, objects that had transformed from carnival prizes into evidence of a life that might have been cut short. "His name is Joseph Chambers," she said, her voice steady despite everything. "He's 6 years old, dark hair, brown eyes. He was wearing a red t-shirt and blue jeans. He had a small stuffed bear that he won at one of the games." Kowalski wrote everything down in a notebook that had seen better days, asking follow-up questions about Joseph's height, weight, and any distinctive features that might help identify him. As Diana provided the details, he found himself studying her face, looking for the subtle signs of deception that sometimes appeared in cases where parents were more involved in their children's disappearances than they initially admitted. He saw nothing but genuine terror. "Tell me exactly what happened tonight. From the time you arrived at the carnival," Kowalski said, settling into the methodical questioning that formed the foundation of any missing person investigation. Diana recounted their evening in careful detail. The rides they had taken, the games they had played, the food they had eaten, and the sequence of events that had led to Joseph's disappearance. Kowalski listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, but mostly watching her face for inconsistencies or hesitation that might suggest she was leaving something out. "You mentioned seeing a man earlier who seemed to be watching the crowds," Kowalski said when she finished. "Can you describe him? Would you recognize him if you saw him again?" "Maybe. I'm not sure." Diana's frustration was evident in her voice. "I should have paid more attention, but I didn't think. I mean, you don't expect something like this to happen." Kowalski nodded. "Ma'am, I want you to know that we're going to do everything we can and find your son. But I need to ask you some difficult questions, and I need you to answer them honestly, even if they seem intrusive or unfair." Diana straightened slightly, steeling herself for what was coming. "Is there anyone who might want to harm Joseph or take him from you? An ex-husband, former boyfriend? Anyone who's shown unusual interest in him?" "No," Diana replied immediately. "Joseph's father isn't in our lives. He's back in Iowa somewhere, and he hasn't had any contact with us since Joseph was a baby. There's no one else. Any custody disputes? Family members who might disagree with how you're raising him?" "No, my parents are dead, and I don't have much family. It's just been me and Joseph." Kowalski made notes and continued with questions about their daily routine, people who had regular contact with Joseph, and whether Diana had noticed anyone following them or showing unusual interest in their family. With each answer, he became more convinced that this was not a case of family abduction or custody dispute gone wrong. While they talked, Officer Janet Pierce arrived at the scene and began coordinating with Morrison to interview carnival workers who might have seen something relevant. Pierce was one of the newer officers on the force, but she had a talent for getting people to talk, especially when they were initially reluctant to cooperate with law enforcement. The carnival workers represented a unique challenge for any police investigation. They were transients by nature, people who had chosen a lifestyle that kept them moving from town to town, often staying ahead of problems that might catch up with them if they remained in one place too long. Many had reasons to avoid extended conversations with police, but the disappearance of a child was the type of situation that could override normal reluctances to get involved. Pierce started with the ride operators who had been working the attractions closest to where Joseph was last seen. The teenager who ran the Ferris wheel remembered Diana and Joseph clearly. They had been one of the last families to ride before the evening crowds began to thin out. "Nice lady, cute kid," he told Pierce. The boy was excited about seeing everything from up high. "They seemed happy, you know, like they were having a good time. Did you notice anyone watching them specifically? Anyone who seemed more interested in them than in the rides?" The teenager considered the question carefully. "There's always people watching, you know. Parents keeping track of their kids, teenagers checking each other out, but I didn't see anyone who seemed weird or anything." Pierce moved on to the game operators, starting with the ring toss, where Diana and Joseph had been standing when the boy disappeared. The man who ran that particular game was in his 50s, with weathered hands and the patient demeanor of someone who had spent decades dealing with customers who blamed their failures on rigged equipment. "I remember them," he said when Pierce showed him the school photograph of Joseph that Diana had provided. "The boy wanted to win that big elephant, but the mom was smart enough not to let him try. Those rings, they're designed to bounce off the bottles no matter how good your aim is. Did you see what happened to them after they stopped at your booth? They walked away toward the Ferris wheel, I think. But then I got busy with other customers and didn't pay attention. Anyone else around that area who seemed to be watching them or following them?" The man paused, his expression growing thoughtful. Now that you mention it, there was this guy who wasn't playing any games but kept walking back and forth through that section of the midway. I noticed him because he seemed nervous, kept checking his watch and looking around like he was waiting for something. Pierce felt the familiar spark of interest that came with a potentially useful lead. Can you describe him? Average-looking guy. 30s, maybe early 40s. Brown hair, jeans, dark shirt. Nothing special about him, which is maybe why I noticed him. Most people at a carnival are either having fun or working. This guy just looked out of place. The description matched what Diana had provided, confirming that the stranger she had noticed was not a product of maternal paranoia, but a real person, whose behavior had been unusual enough to catch the attention of multiple witnesses. Pierce continued her interviews while Kowalski worked with Morrison to organize a more systematic search of the carnival grounds. By 11 o'clock, they had spoken with every carnival worker who had been on duty during the relevant time period, but the results were frustratingly inconclusive. Several people remembered seeing Joseph with Diana earlier in the evening. A few recalled the mysterious stranger who had been observed near the ring toss game and other locations throughout the midway, but no one had witnessed the actual moment of Joseph's disappearance, and no one could provide additional details about the stranger that might help identify him. As the last of the carnival rides shut down and the midway lights were reduced to basic security illumination, Kowalski made the decision to expand the search beyond the fairgrounds. If Joseph had wandered away from the carnival, he could be anywhere in Cedar Falls by now, possibly lost and scared in the darkness. "We're going to need more help," he told Pierce as they regrouped near the entrance gate. "I'm calling the county sheriff's office and the state police. We need search dogs, more officers, and someone needs to start checking hospitals and bus stations." Pierce nodded. "What about the carnival? They're planning to leave town tomorrow morning." Kowalski looked toward the darkened midway, where carnies were already beginning the process of dismantling equipment and loading trucks for the move to their next location. "We can't hold the entire carnival without more evidence, but I want to interview every worker individually before they leave. Someone knows something they haven't told us yet." By midnight, the search had expanded to include the residential neighborhoods surrounding the elementary school, with officers and volunteers checking yards, garages, and any structure where a child might be hiding or trapped. Diana insisted on participating despite Kowalski's suggestion that she might be more comfortable waiting at the police station. "I can't just sit somewhere," she told him as they walked through the darkened streets of her neighborhood. "He might hear my voice and call out. He might be scared and looking for me." The desperation in her voice was heartbreaking, but Kowalski understood her need to keep moving, to feel like she was doing something to find her son. He had seen it before in other parents facing similar situations, the inability to accept that their role had become largely passive while professionals took over the search. As they moved through the residential areas, Diana called Joseph's name repeatedly, her voice carrying through the quiet streets, while other searchers used flashlights to check behind garbage cans, under porches, and in any space large enough to conceal a child. The systematic nature of the search was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it represented a professional response to the crisis. Terrifying because it acknowledged that Joseph might be in a situation where he could not respond to their calls. At 1:30 in the morning, the search dogs arrived from the county sheriff's office. German shepherds trained in tracking and search and rescue operations. They represented the best hope of following Joseph's trail, if he had indeed left the carnival grounds under his own power. The dogs were given items of Joseph's clothing that Diana had retrieved from their house, allowing them to establish his scent before beginning their work. Kowalski watched as the handlers worked with their animals, noting the professional competence that came with years of experience in similar situations. The first dog picked up Joseph's trail immediately at the ring toss game, confirming that he had indeed been in that location. The trail led toward the Ferris wheel, consistent with Diana's account of their evening, but then seemed to disappear entirely near the ride's base. "It's like he just vanished," the dog handler told Kowalski. "The scent trail stops dead about 20 feet from the Ferris wheel. Either he got into a vehicle, or he didn't finish the sentence." But Kowalski understood the implication. A second dog was brought in to confirm the results, but the outcome was the same. Joseph's scent could be traced to a specific point near the Ferris wheel, and then it simply ended, as if he had been lifted off the ground and carried away. The discovery transformed the investigation from a missing child case into something potentially much more serious. If Joseph had been taken against his will, every minute that passed reduced the chances of finding him alive. Kowalski radioed for additional resources and began coordinating with state police agencies that specialized in child abduction cases. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the Cedar Falls Elementary School had been transformed into a command center for what was now officially classified as a potential kidnapping investigation. FBI agents were en route from the regional office, and an Amber Alert system, still relatively new in 1991, was being prepared for distribution to law enforcement agencies across the Midwest. Diana sat in one of the small plastic chairs from a kindergarten classroom, surrounded by investigators who were asking increasingly detailed questions about every aspect of her life and relationship with Joseph. The questions had moved beyond the basic facts of the case to explore more intimate details: her financial situation, her dating history, her relationship with Joseph's father, and any problems or stresses that might have motivated someone to target their family. "I keep telling you, there's no one who would do this," Diana said, her patience finally beginning to crack under the pressure of repeated questioning. "Joseph is a good kid. Everyone likes him. I don't have enemies, I don't owe money to dangerous people, and I don't have an ex-husband who's fighting for custody. Someone took my son, and while you're sitting here asking me the same questions over and over again, he's getting further away." Special Agent Karen Walsh had arrived from the FBI field office an hour earlier, bringing with her the resources and expertise that local law enforcement lacked for child abduction cases. She was a woman in her 40s who had worked dozens of similar investigations, and she understood the delicate balance required to gather necessary information while maintaining the cooperation of panicked parents. "Mrs. Chambers, I know this is difficult," Walsh said, settling into a chair across from Diana. "But the questions we're asking have helped us solve cases like this before. Most child abductions are committed by people who have some connection to the family. Even if that connection isn't obvious, we need to explore every possibility." "Then why aren't you looking for the man who was watching us at the carnival?" Diana demanded. "Multiple people saw him. He was acting strange, and now Joseph is gone. Doesn't that seem more important than asking me about my personal life?" Walsh nodded. "We are looking for him. We have officers canvassing local motels and hotels. We're checking vehicle registrations for anyone who might match his description. And we're working with Carnival management to get names and background information on anyone who might have had access to the grounds tonight." The Carnival investigation had indeed intensified as the evening progressed. Pierce had worked with Morrison to compile a list of everyone who had worked the event, including not just Carnival employees but also local volunteers and temporary workers who had been hired for the Cedar Falls stop. Background checks were being run on anyone with a criminal history, particularly those with previous arrests involving children or violent crimes. The results were troubling, but not conclusive. 3 of the Carnival workers had criminal records that included theft and assault charges, but none had histories of crimes against children. 2 others had outstanding warrants in other states, but for minor offenses unrelated to violence or abduction. More interesting was the discovery that the Carnival company, traveling under the name Midwest Family Entertainment, had been the subject of complaints in other towns about poor background screening of temporary workers. "It's possible we're dealing with someone who used the carnival as cover to get close to potential victims," Walsh told the assembled investigators as dawn began to break over Cedar Falls. "Carnivals provide perfect opportunities for predators. Lots of children in a crowded, chaotic environment, plus the built-in excuse to be somewhere temporarily before moving on. The theory made sense, but it also raised disturbing questions about how many other children might have been targeted at previous stops on the Carnival's tour. Walsh had already contacted law enforcement agencies in towns where Midwest Family Entertainment had recently operated, asking them to review any reports of missing children or suspicious behavior during the Carnival's visit. Diana had been moved to a small office within the school to shield her from the growing media attention, but she could see the commotion through the windows. Police cars, FBI vehicles, news trucks, and crowds of curious residents who had heard about the disappearance and come to see what was happening. "This feels like a nightmare," she told Walsh during a brief break in the questioning. "Yesterday morning I was worried about whether we had enough money for cotton candy, and now there are FBI agents asking me if I have any enemies who might want to kidnap my son." Walsh understood the surreal nature of the situation from the parents' perspective. "Most of the families I work with say the same thing. One moment everything is normal, and the next moment your entire world has changed. Do you think he's still alive?" Diana asked, voicing the question that had been haunting her since the early morning hours when the reality of the situation had fully set in. Walsh hesitated before answering, knowing that false hope could be as damaging as despair. The statistics vary depending on the circumstances, but most children who are abducted by strangers are killed within the first 3 hours. We're past that timeline now, which could be either good or bad news. "What do you mean?" "If someone took Joseph impulsively, acting on opportunity rather than planning, he might be dead already. But if this was a planned abduction, if someone specifically targeted him or your family, he might be kept alive for ransom demands or other purposes." The clinical nature of the explanation was both informative and horrifying. But Diana needed to understand the realities of her situation. She had spent the night clinging to the hope that Joseph had simply wandered off and would be found sleeping under a tree or hiding in someone's garage. But that possibility was becoming increasingly remote. At 8 o'clock Sunday morning, the Carnival began its departure from Cedar Falls. Despite the ongoing investigation, law enforcement lacked sufficient evidence to detain the entire operation, and Carnival management was cooperating with requests for employee information and background checks. Diana stood at the window of the elementary school office, watching the trucks and trailers pull away from the fairgrounds, where she had spent the previous evening enjoying what she had thought would be a perfect night with her son. The Ferris wheel was the last ride to be dismantled, its lights going dark as it was reduced to components that could be transported to the next town on the circuit. "They're leaving," she said to Walsh, who had joined her at the window. "And if it doesn't?" Walsh didn't answer immediately. The truth was that child abduction cases grew significantly more difficult to solve with each passing hour. And despite the resources being devoted to Joseph's disappearance, the investigation was already running into the kinds of dead ends that characterized unsolved cases. By noon on Sunday, the scope of the search had expanded to include a 50-mile radius around Cedar Falls. State police had established roadblocks on major highways, checking vehicles that might be transporting a child against his will. Airports and bus stations were on alert for anyone traveling with a boy matching Joseph's description. The volunteer search effort had grown to include hundreds of local residents who were combing through fields, wooded areas, and abandoned buildings where a kidnapper might have taken a victim. The searches were coordinated through the command center at the elementary school, with teams assigned to specific areas to ensure that no location was overlooked. Diana had been given a brief break from questioning and was trying to rest in a teacher's lounge that had been converted into a temporary family area. She hadn't eaten since the cotton candy at the Carnival, and sleep was impossible despite her exhaustion. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Joseph's face at the top of the Ferris wheel, looking out over their town while describing everything he could see in the distance. Agent Walsh found her there, holding a cup of coffee that had grown cold while she stared at nothing in particular. I wanted to update you on what we've learned so far, Walsh said, settling into a chair beside Diana. We've identified the man who was seen watching you at the carnival. Diana looked up sharply, hope and fear warring in her expression. Who is he? His name is Robert Henley, age 34, from Louisville, Kentucky. He has a record of petty theft and public intoxication, but nothing involving violence or crimes against children. Where is he now? That's the problem. He checked out of his motel room early this morning, paid in cash and left no forwarding address. His car, a 1987 blue Ford pickup truck, hasn't been spotted since last night. The information was simultaneously encouraging and terrifying. They had identified the mysterious stranger, but his disappearance seemed to confirm suspicions that he was involved in Joseph's abduction. We've issued a BOLO alert for Henley and his vehicle, Walsh continued. Every law enforcement agency in the region is looking for him. If he's traveling with Joseph, someone will spot them. What if he's not traveling? What if he... Diana couldn't finish the question, but Walsh understood what she was asking. We're searching every property associated with Henley in Kentucky, and we're checking for any connections he might have to this area. If he's holding Joseph somewhere local, we'll find them. The investigation continued throughout Sunday, with new leads being generated and pursued on an hourly basis. A trucker reported seeing a blue pickup truck with Kentucky plates at a rest stop near the Illinois border, but the man driving it was alone and appeared to be older than Henley. A store clerk in a town 30 miles away recalled selling snacks to a man with a young boy, but when shown Joseph's photograph, she wasn't certain it was the same child. Each lead represented hope, followed by disappointment, and Diana began to understand why families of missing children often described the experience as an emotional roller coaster that never stopped moving. By Sunday evening, more than 36 hours had passed since Joseph's disappearance, and the harsh realities of child abduction statistics were becoming impossible to ignore. The FBI had brought in specialists who worked specifically on cases involving crimes against children, and their presence indicated that the investigation was moving in directions that no one wanted to contemplate. Diana sat in the same kindergarten chair where she had spent most of the past day, surrounded by the detritus of an investigation that seemed to be producing more questions than answers. Coffee cups, notepads, maps marked with search areas, and photographs of Joseph that had been reproduced for distribution to law enforcement agencies, all evidence of the massive effort being made to find her son and all reminders that he was still missing. Mrs. Chambers, Agent Walsh approached her with an expression that Diana had learned to recognize as the bearer of potentially significant news. We need to talk about something that's been discovered. Diana steeled herself for whatever was coming, knowing that after 36 hours of disappointment, she should not hope for good news. What is it? A maintenance worker at the carnival found something this morning while cleaning up the area where the Ferris wheel had been set up. Walsh held out a small evidence bag containing a child's sneaker, a white athletic shoe with blue trim, that Diana recognized immediately. It was Joseph's shoe, and it was covered in what appeared to be dried blood. The blood on Joseph's shoe was type O positive, matching the medical records that Diana had provided to investigators. Under normal circumstances, this would have been enough to shift the investigation from missing person to homicide. But Agent Walsh had worked enough child abduction cases to know that blood evidence could be misleading. Children fell down, scraped their knees, and sometimes lost shoes in the process. The blood might be significant, or it might simply indicate that Joseph had suffered a minor injury before his disappearance. Still, the discovery changed everything. By Monday morning, 48 hours after Joseph vanished from the carnival, the FBI had established a permanent command post in Cedar Falls and was coordinating with law enforcement agencies across 7 states. The search for Robert Henley and his blue pickup truck had become a top priority, with his photograph distributed to every police station, sheriff's office, and state patrol post from Ohio to Texas. Diana had been moved from the elementary school to a small conference room at the Cedar Falls Police Department. where she could have more privacy while still remaining close to the investigation. She sat at a rectangular table that had seen countless interrogations and witness interviews, surrounded by the accumulated materials of an investigation that had consumed the resources of multiple law enforcement agency files. Photographs, maps, evidence bags, and computer printouts covered every available surface, creating a paper monument to the complexity of finding one missing child in a world full of places to hide. Mrs. Chambers, Agent Walsh, entered the room carrying a fresh cup of coffee and wearing the expression Diana had learned meant there was news to discuss. "We've had some developments overnight." Diana looked up from the school photograph of Joseph that she had been holding, studying his face as if she could find clues there about what had happened to him. "Did you find Robert Henley?" "Not yet, but we found his truck." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Diana was afraid to consider. She had spent 2 days hoping that finding Henley's vehicle would lead them to Joseph, but now she realized that the discovery might represent the end of hope rather than its fulfillment. Where? Abandoned in a rest area parking lot near the Indiana border. It had been there since Sunday morning, according to witnesses. No sign of Henley, and no sign that Joseph was ever in the vehicle. Walsh settled into the chair across from Diana, her manner careful and professional. "We've processed the truck for evidence, fingerprints, fibers, DNA, anything that might tell us what happened. The results are still being analyzed, but I wanted you to know we found it." Diana processed this information with the strange calmness that had developed over the past 2 days, a protective numbness that allowed her to function despite the horror of her situation. "So he abandoned the truck and disappeared. That means he's still out there. It means he's no longer traveling in that particular vehicle," Walsh corrected gently. "He could have had another car waiting, could have stolen a different vehicle, could be traveling on foot, or could be anywhere. We're checking every possibility." The conversation was interrupted by Detective Pierce, who knocked on the doorframe before entering the room. Her expression was grave, and she carried a manila folder that Diana had learned usually contained information that no one wanted to share. "Agent Walsh, we need to talk about the Carnival maintenance worker who found the shoe," Pierce said, glancing at Diana with obvious reluctance to continue the conversation in front of her. "It's all right," Diana said before Walsh could suggest she step outside. "I need to hear whatever you've discovered. This is my son we're talking about." Pierce hesitated, then opened the folder and removed a series of photographs and documents. "We've been background checking everyone who had access to the Carnival grounds, including the cleanup crew that worked Sunday morning. Most of them are local people, part-time workers who've done this kind of job for years." "Most of them," Walsh repeated, sensing there was an exception. "The man who found Joseph's shoe is named David Brennan. He's worked cleanup at various events around the region for about 6 months. Clean record, good references, seemed completely legitimate." "Seemed?" Diana asked. Pierce spread several documents across the table. "We ran a deeper background check this morning and discovered that David Brennan doesn't exist. The name is an alias. The social security number belongs to someone who died in 1987. And the address he gave leads to a vacant lot in Columbus." The revelation sent a chill through the room that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Diana stared at the documents, trying to process the implications of what Pierce was telling them. "You're saying the person who found Joseph's shoe was using a fake identity?" "That's exactly what I'm saying. And it gets worse." Pierce removed another set of photographs from the folder. "We showed his picture to some of the Carnival workers who were still in the area Sunday morning. 3 of them identified him as someone who had been hanging around the grounds Saturday night, asking questions about cleanup procedures and which areas would need to be searched for lost items." Walsh leaned forward, her attention now fully focused on Pierce's report. He was casing the site, looking for the best place to plant evidence that would be discovered during the cleanup. Diana felt the world tilt around her as the implications of this information crashed into her consciousness. The shoe, the blood, the convenient discovery by a cleanup worker who didn't exist. It was all part of an elaborate deception designed to make them believe Joseph was dead while the real perpetrator escaped with him. "Where is Crawford now?" Walsh asked, her voice tight with the controlled anger that came from realizing they had been manipulated by someone who specialized in crimes against children. "That's what we're trying to figure out. He disappeared Sunday afternoon, right after he found the shoe and gave his statement to officers. We've been looking for Robert Henley, but we should have been looking for Thomas Crawford." The room fell silent as the three women contemplated the implications of this discovery. For 2 days they had been chasing the wrong suspect while the real kidnapper had been hiding in plain sight, pretending to be a helpful citizen who had discovered evidence of a crime. "You think Crawford took Joseph?" Diana asked, though she already knew the answer. "I think Crawford is a predator who has been planning this for months," Walsh replied. "The fake identity, the cleanup job that gave him legitimate access to the carnival grounds, the planted evidence designed to make us think Joseph was dead. It's all too sophisticated to be improvised." Pierce nodded in agreement. This was a carefully planned abduction. Crawford probably identified Joseph and his mother weeks ago, studied their routines, and waited for the right opportunity. The carnival provided perfect cover, lots of chaos, lots of strangers, and a built-in explanation for why a child might disappear. Diana felt a spark of something she had almost forgotten existed. Hope. If Joseph wasn't dead, if the blood on his shoe was part of an elaborate deception, rather than evidence of violence, then there was still a chance he could be rescued alive. Walsh was already reaching for her radio to coordinate with the command center. "We find Thomas Crawford, and we find him fast. If he's been planning this for months, he has a location where he's holding Joseph. Somewhere private, somewhere secure, somewhere he thinks we'll never look." The investigation shifted into overdrive as law enforcement resources were redirected from searching for Robert Henley to tracking down Thomas Crawford. His real identity opened up new avenues of inquiry: previous addresses, known associates, family connections, and the pattern of his previous crimes that might provide clues about where he would take a kidnapped child. Crawford's criminal history painted a picture of a predator who had been escalating his behavior for years. Early arrests for voyeurism and possession of illegal material had progressed to direct contact offenses, and his methods had grown more sophisticated with each incident. The use of false identities and elaborate planning suggested someone who had learned from past mistakes and was determined not to be caught. "He's had 6 months to prepare for this," Walsh told the assembled investigators as they gathered around maps and computer terminals in the command center. 6 months to find the perfect location, establish his fake identity, and select his target. This isn't someone who's going to make obvious mistakes. Detective Pierce had been coordinating with agencies in other states where Crawford had previously lived and committed crimes. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. A tendency to operate in small towns where law enforcement resources were limited, careful selection of victims from single-parent families with limited support systems, and a history of disappearing completely when investigations got too close. "He's done this before," Pierce reported to the group. "Maybe not exactly this, but similar situations. In Kentucky, there was a 7-year-old boy who disappeared from a county fair in 1989. The case was never solved, but the timeline matches up with when Crawford was living in that area." "Any other connections?" Walsh asked. "Possibly. We're checking missing person reports from every location where Crawford lived or worked over the past 5 years. If there's a pattern, we'll find it." While investigators worked to reconstruct Crawford's history and identify possible locations where he might be holding Joseph, Diana found herself in the strange position of feeling hopeful for the first time since Saturday night. The discovery of the deception had transformed Joseph from a likely murder victim back into a missing child who might still be rescued. But hope came with its own torture. Every hour that passed without finding Crawford meant another hour that Joseph was alone with a man whose criminal record suggested he was capable of unspeakable acts against children. The knowledge that her son was alive somewhere was almost as difficult to bear as the possibility that he might be dead. On Tuesday morning, 72 hours after Joseph's disappearance, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, Diana's elderly neighbor who spent most of her time watching television and observing the neighborhood through her front window, called the police with information she thought might be relevant. "I didn't think it was important at first," she told Officer Pierce when she arrived at the Patterson house, "but I've been seeing all the news reports, and something's been bothering me about Saturday." Pierce sat in the cramped living room that smelled of cats and arthritis medication, listening carefully as Mrs. Patterson described what she had observed. That morning, before Diana and Joseph left for the carnival, there was a man working on something across the street. He had a utility truck and was doing something with the telephone pole, but it seemed odd because we hadn't had any problems with phone service. "Can you describe the man?" "Middle-aged, maybe 40 or so, brown hair, wearing work clothes. He had that truck there for about 2 hours, but I never saw him actually working on anything. Mostly he just seemed to be watching Diana's house." Pierce felt the familiar surge of excitement that came with a potentially significant lead. "Did you see what company he worked for? Any markings on the truck?" "That's the thing," Mrs. Patterson said, leaning forward conspiratorially. "I've lived here for 30 years, and I know all the utility workers who service this area. I'd never seen this man before, and his truck didn't have any company logos on it, just a plain white truck with some equipment in the back." Pierce thanked Mrs. Patterson and immediately radioed the information to the command center. Within minutes, investigators were canvassing the neighborhood, asking other residents if they had noticed the utility truck or the man who had been operating it. The canvass revealed additional witnesses who had seen the mysterious utility worker on Saturday morning, all of them noting that his presence seemed unusual for a weekend day, when utility companies typically didn't perform routine maintenance. More importantly, one resident had noticed the truck's license plate and had written it down because she was concerned about unauthorized work being done in the neighborhood. The license plate led investigators to a truck rental company in Columbus, where records showed that the vehicle had been rented for the weekend by someone using the identification of David Brennan, the same false identity that Thomas Crawford had used to get the carnival cleanup job. "He was conducting surveillance," Walsh told Diana as they reviewed this new information. "Crawford had been watching you and Joseph for weeks, possibly months. He knew your routines, knew when you would be leaving for the carnival, and knew exactly how to position himself to grab Joseph when the opportunity presented itself." The revelation was both horrifying and encouraging. Horrifying because it meant that Joseph had been targeted by a predator who had studied their lives in intimate detail. Encouraging because it suggested Crawford was methodical rather than impulsive, which meant he was more likely to keep Joseph alive for whatever purposes he had planned. But where? The answer came from an analysis of Crawford's financial records and phone communications over the past 6 months. FBI forensic accountants had traced a series of cash transactions that led to the rental of a small cabin in a remote area of Wayne National Forest, about 90 miles southeast of Cedar Falls. The cabin had been rented through a third party using another false identity, and the lease payments had been made in cash through a series of intermediaries that had taken investigators 3 days to unravel. But the trail was clear. Crawford had been planning this abduction for months, and he had prepared a secure location where he could hold his victim without fear of discovery. On Tuesday afternoon, exactly 72 hours after Joseph disappeared from the carnival, a multi-agency task force of FBI agents, state police officers, and local sheriff's deputies surrounded the remote cabin where Thomas Crawford was believed to be holding the kidnapped boy. Diana had begged to be included in the rescue operation, but Walsh had firmly refused. "If Joseph is in that cabin, we need to get him out safely without any distractions. That means only trained law enforcement personnel." Instead, Diana waited at the command center in Cedar Falls, surrounded by investigators who monitored radio communications from the scene, while she sat in the same chair where she had spent the past 3 days, hoping for news that never seemed to come. The cabin was located at the end of a dirt road that wound through dense forest for nearly 2 miles from the nearest paved highway. It was isolated, private, and exactly the type of location where someone could hold a kidnapped child without fear of being discovered by accident. The decision was made to attempt a direct assault rather than negotiations, based on Crawford's history of violence and the risk that he might harm Joseph if he realized law enforcement had found him. The team moved quickly and quietly, surrounding the cabin and preparing to enter through multiple access points simultaneously. At exactly 3:47 p.m. on Tuesday afternoon, FBI agents burst through the front and back doors of the cabin, shouting commands and searching for the kidnapped child they had spent 3 days trying to locate. They found Joseph in a small back bedroom, unharmed but terrified, tied to a bed with rope and duct tape. He was dirty and obviously frightened, but he was alive and appeared to have suffered no serious physical injuries. The moment Diana heard Walsh's voice over the radio confirming that Joseph had been found alive, she collapsed into her chair with relief that felt like a physical force. After 3 days of living with the possibility that she would never see her son again, the knowledge that he was safe and would be coming home seemed too overwhelming to process. Joseph was transported to a hospital in Columbus for medical evaluation and psychological assessment, while Crawford was taken into federal custody on charges of kidnapping, child endangerment, and multiple violations related to his use of false identities. The case that had begun with a child's disappearance from a carnival had become one of the most complex abduction investigations in Ohio's recent history. Diana was reunited with Joseph in the hospital that evening, holding him while he cried and apologized for wandering away from her at the carnival, apparently still not fully understanding that he had been the victim of a carefully planned crime rather than the result of his own misbehavior. "I was looking at the games," he told her through tears, "and this man said you wanted me to come with him to find you, but then he took me to his car and we drove for a long time." The story Crawford had told Joseph was that Diana had sent him to collect her son because there was a family emergency, a lie that had been convincing enough to get a 6-year-old boy to cooperate with his own kidnapping. By the time Joseph realized something was wrong, he was already at the cabin and completely dependent on his captor for survival. Agent Walsh interviewed Joseph the following day with the help of child psychologists who specialized in working with victims of abduction. The boy's account confirmed much of what investigators had suspected about Crawford's methods and motivations, while also revealing details about the 3 days he had spent in captivity. "He kept saying he was my friend and that he was going to take care of me," Joseph told the interviewers. "But he wouldn't let me go outside, and he wouldn't let me call you. I asked him every day when I could go home, but he said we had to wait." Crawford's capture marked the end of the immediate crisis, but it also raised disturbing questions about how many other children might have been victimized by his elaborate methods of stalking and abduction. The investigation expanded to include cold cases from multiple states where Crawford had lived or worked, and the evidence suggested that Joseph might not have been his first victim. Robert Henley, the man whose suspicious behavior at the carnival had initially made him a suspect, was eventually located and cleared of any involvement in Joseph's disappearance. It turned out that he had been at the carnival for legitimate reasons, but had left town quickly because of outstanding warrants for minor offenses in Kentucky. His nervous behavior had been the result of trying to avoid contact with law enforcement, not evidence of involvement in a kidnapping. The bloody shoe that had so dramatically altered the direction of the investigation was determined to have been planted by Crawford as part of his deception. The blood was Joseph's, taken from a minor injury Crawford had inflicted for exactly that purpose, and the shoe had been deliberately placed where it would be discovered during the cleanup process. As the details of Crawford's elaborate plan became clear, Diana found herself struggling with questions that had no comfortable answers. How long had this predator been watching her family? How many other children were walking around unaware that someone was studying their routines and planning their abduction? And how was it possible for someone with Crawford's criminal history to operate with such sophistication while law enforcement agencies had no idea he existed? The trial of Thomas Crawford became a media sensation that attracted attention from across the country. His conviction on federal kidnapping charges resulted in a life sentence without possibility of parole. But the case also led to changes in how law enforcement agencies share information about predators who use false identities to avoid detection. Joseph recovered from his ordeal with the resilience that seemed to be built into 6-year-old boys, though Diana noticed that he was more cautious around strangers and less willing to wander away from her in crowded places. The psychological counseling helped both of them process the trauma of the experience, but Diana knew that some aspects of what they had been through would stay with them forever. 6 months after the carnival, Diana and Joseph attended a ceremony where several of the investigators who had worked on the case were recognized for their efforts. Joseph presented Agent Walsh with a drawing he had made, showing FBI agents rescuing a stick-figure boy from a cabin in the woods, complete with helicopters and police cars that filled the sky with protection. "Thank you for finding me," he told Walsh with the solemn sincerity that only children could manage. Looking at her son, healthy, happy, and safely returned to the life that had been stolen from him for 3 terrifying days, Diana understood that some stories did have endings that justified the word rescue, but she also understood that other families in other towns might not be as fortunate as theirs had been. The carnival came back to Cedar Falls the following summer, and Diana found herself standing at her kitchen window, watching the Ferris wheel rise against the evening sky, while Joseph played in their backyard. For a moment she considered taking him to experience again the magic of carnival lights and cotton candy, and games where stuffed animals waited to be won. Then she closed the curtains, locked the doors, and spent the evening at home with her son, grateful for the ordinary safety of an unremarkable Tuesday night in a small Ohio town, where the most dangerous thing in their lives was the possibility of staying up past bedtime. Some magic, she had learned, carried too high a price. The case files of Thomas Crawford's crimes filled 3 filing cabinets at the FBI field office, representing not just the investigation that had saved Joseph, but also the cold cases that would never be solved. The other children whose disappearances would remain forever unexplained. In the end, Diana understood that they had been extraordinarily lucky, not just because Joseph had been found alive, but because they had been chosen by a predator who was methodical enough to keep his victims alive long enough for law enforcement to find them. Other families she knew would not be so fortunate, but on that Tuesday evening, with Joseph safely in his own bed and the carnival lights fading into memory, Diana allowed herself to believe that justice and rescue was still possible in a world where predators wore the faces of helpful strangers, and evil could plan its crimes with the patience of someone who had nothing but time. The Ferris wheel would return to Cedar Falls every summer, carrying new children up into the night sky where they could look out over their small town and see the world spread out below them in patterns that seemed safe and predictable. And every summer, Diana would close her curtains and remember the night when the lights went out and her son disappeared into darkness that had almost swallowed him forever. In the end, the most remarkable thing about Joseph's rescue was not the sophistication of the investigation or the dedication of the agents who had worked around the clock to find him. It was the simple fact that he had come home at all, in a world where too many children never did.